Hi, and welcome to this series where I'm going to be going through the ITIL4 practices individually, and I'm going to give you the main headline points you need to be aware of to support your base knowledge regarding ITIL4. I'm also going to be giving you some overall context and some real-world experience from the organisations I've worked in before. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, hit the bell, you'll get the updates. Okay, so let's get to it. Today I'm going to be covering off availability management. So availability management is from the service management practice. So there's 17 practices there. As a reminder, practice is a set of organisational resources designed for performing work or accomplishing an objective. So let's cover off a couple of points here regarding availability management. So these are things to think about, to ponder on, maybe some takeaway messages. And this is just in the widest sense of availability management. So look through the lens of availability management as end to end, i.e. holistically. You remember that ITIL guiding principle on that, right? So look at availability end to end. Don't just look at it as it's the service or an application or a database or whatever it may be. Look at it from an end to end. And what I mean by that is look at all the various components that make up availability. So real world experience, the application may be up and available, but the database, there's a problem with it, or the network, there's a problem with it. So technically the application is available. The problem is when people use it, it doesn't work. So the database doesn't recall the data, or people can't even connect to it because the network's not. Or even worse, perhaps the application is available, and the network is available, in inverted commas, but the performance on that network is so poor, your customer's not using it. So is that still technically available? Have you defined that? Something to think about. You may also hear people talk about availability as uptime. So many customers and many service providers will use service level agreements or key performance indicators to measure the effectiveness of the kit and the service. Perhaps you'll hear talk of 5 nines, 99.999% available. When companies use cloud services, so I'm thinking of AWS, Azure, Google, for example. When we talk about availability, that's referring to the individual cloud services that are being used to run an application and provide that service. Architecture is a really key point in terms of availability management. It has a large input into it. So if you're designing a new service from scratch, really think about that architecture. Make sure it's meeting the requirements. If the service is already in production and operating, is there some continual improvement activities that can improve the architecture, which will make availability better? It will improve availability. So let's get to some ITIL4 elements. So ITIL4 defines availability as the ability of an IT service or other configuration item to perform its agreed function when required. So let's break that down. I like to think of that. So let's break it down into it's a service doing what was agreed that it said it would do. It will do it how it was expected it would be done, and it's doing it when it was supposed to be doing it. Let's think about ITIL a little wider here in terms of the manual. So there's talk of enabling candidates to look at IT service management through an end-to-end operating model. I always like to think of this as looking through the lens of the creation, the delivery and the CI, the continual improvement of those products and services. And ITIL4 states the purpose of availability management being ensuring services deliver agreed levels of availability to meet the needs of customers and users. Key metrics for availability, performance and availability management. I'll go into a bit more detail on that later on during this session, but mean time between failure, abbreviated to MTBF, it's a maintenance metric. It's used to indicate the duration that a piece of equipment, that a piece of kit or a service operates without any kind of disturbance, and it's only applicable to repairable items, by the way. We'll discuss that much later. The larger that number, the better in this sense. So you obviously want the greatest amount of time between any kind of outage. And then mean time to resolution, MTTR, smaller is the key here. You want that to be as small as possible. So it's the time from something going horribly wrong and it's not available to it is now available. So the smaller the number. And then mean time to restore service, so MTRS, that measures how quickly a service is restored after a failure. So availability management activities typically will include negotiating and agreeing achievable targets for availability. Now bear in mind, some of that negotiation and agreement activity may be with internal teams, or they may be with external teams, or a service integrator, or some kind of outsourcing arrangement. The second activity typically you would expect to see is around designing the infrastructure and designing the applications that can deliver the required availability. So designing architecture, you can design something to be much more resilient in one sense over another sense. There are design considerations there around infrastructure that will have a huge impact on your availability management. Cost is clearly a consideration there, because if you're designing something that is fully resilient or as good as resilient, you know, perhaps you're thinking multiple data centers, maybe you're thinking 2 of everything, maybe you're thinking that self-healing, that there's a cost associated with that element. So designing infrastructure and designing the applications, you can design those in a way to deliver the required availability, but have a thought around, well, there's a cost associated with doing that. Also, another activity is around ensuring the services and the various components are able to grab that data, that they can collect the data that you need to measure availability. So there's a technical element through there, but there's also a people element to that as well. So think about how will you be measuring availability. Let's assume you've got all the data, but let's just make sure we're clear as to what is the period that we are measuring. Is it business hours? Is it 9 to 5? Is it 24/7? But again, just expand on the activity may well be around ensuring services and components are able to collect the data to measure availability. Just go a step back a tiny bit there in terms of, are you clear have we defined what availability is? And then clearly you need those services and components to collect that data. And then monitoring, analysing and reporting on availability. Think about tooling. What kind of tooling will you use? Will you use your own tooling? Will you use a service provider? Will you use a commercial off the shelf? Will it be internally developed? Perhaps automation. Certainly in monitoring, you want that automated as much as possible in terms of if there is some kind of activity, you want it to raise that flag quickly. You want that to reporting into your service management tool. You want perhaps if there's some kind of metric that needs to be reported back to your customer. And just have a think about which lens are you looking at reporting through, which lens are you looking at monitoring, analysing, from your customer's perspective or from your service provider's perspective. And then the improvement to availability. So clearly there are interfaces that directly impact availability and are involved in that. So I can think of incident management as an example, a priority 1 incident, a P1 incident, and you've spun up a bridge and it's all been, you've got all the right subject matter experts on the call and you're diagnosing and you fixed it, great. Hopefully you will have a process that then rolls into your problem management activity, and there'll be a major incident report and a root cause analysis report. Brilliant. This is all reactive stuff. Fantastic. Make sure that feeds into the availability management practice as to, okay, well, this is what we can do to improve that from not happening again, which clearly has a knock-on effect around availability. And be proactive as well around planning improvements. Make sure you're not just being reactive in that case I just talked through there, but think about the proactive stuff. There's more on that later in terms of certain components have a defined life. There's a mean time before they are going to fail. So perhaps an availability piece of work could be around looking at some of those components and playing the statistics game there as to, statistically, that piece of equipment is X years old, or it's operated X number of hours. So statistically, it's in that period where it's maybe going to cause an outage and impact our availability. So proactiveness there, I suppose, is the key. And continual improvement from the general management practice there. So we're talking about the service management practice here in terms of availability, but clearly continual improvement from the general management practice needs to be involved there. Okay, so let's talk around availability of the service generally. So it depends, clearly it depends on how often a service fails and how quickly it recovers. There's various ways of expressing this, and metrics that you would come across is the mean time before failure and mean time to restore service. So MTBF and MTSR. These are key metrics for measuring availability. So let's look at mean time before failure as a summary. So the summary there is around the larger number is what you're looking for. So what that's measuring is the distance in time between outage number 1 that impacted availability and outage number 2 that impacted availability. So hopefully that number is a large number. Maybe it's measured in years. It failed in 2020 and it failed in 2021, or maybe it's hours or quarters or whatever your organisation would measure that. But the key takeaway for around mean time before failure is you want a big number there. The other point there, and I referred to it earlier on the presentation about being proactive, clearly you can sort of look at some of these. If something's occurring on a regular basis, the obvious no-brainer, if you like, is to think, well, if this is failing on a regular basis and it's impacting our availability management stats, maybe we need to replace it, of course. So mean time to resolution, as I mentioned before, that's the opposite. You want a smaller number there. The smaller, the better. So that's measured in times. So that could be seconds, it could be minutes, it could be hours, hopefully not days, but how long is it from the start of something to happen to it being back again? And you may well see that in terms of SLA metrics, for example. So a service provider or a service integrator may be saying your priority 1, 2, 3 and 4 metrics, as an example, may be, okay, well, a priority 1 we will resolve in 90% of the time in 3 hours, or a P2 90% in 6 hours. So you can sort of tie that into those metrics. And then mean time to restore service, as it sounds, it's basically how quickly is something being restored after a failure. So to work out the mean time before failure, it's relatively straightforward. All you're doing is you're dividing the number of operational hours, and I'll come back to that word and that definition of what are operational hours, but the mean time before failure, all you need to do is divide the total number of operational hours in a period, whatever that period is, by the number of failures that occurred in that period. Usually it's hours that it's measured, so you would say an asset may have been operational for X number of hours during the last period, so that period could be a year, but it failed Y times. So maybe it's been fairly reliable, and those are low numbers, or maybe they're higher numbers. To add complexity here, so when we talk about operational hours, it's really important that you define that, because that can mask some of the results and the data that somebody's giving you. For example, if it's being defined as business hours, and maybe your business hours are 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday to Friday, or is it being measured 24/7, that will have a direct consequence on your SLA data and your reporting. Stating the obvious, if an item is failing a lot, you need to think about replacing it, mitigating it, putting better resilience in place, update it, whatever. RCA and problem management is definitely the way to go here. There's incident management, there's problem, there's change, there's continual improvement practices that can all contribute to improve that and help that. The mean time between failure, it's a predicted elapsed time between an inherent failure of an electrical item, or it can be a mechanical item as well, during normal system operation. It can be calculated in as an average, so it's an arithmetic mean, and it's the average time between failures of a system, basically. I've mentioned that you can use it proactively as well. You can use it for planning. So this device may have a mean time before failure of X, and then you can use that. So you can use that data. So if you know a component or an item fails every, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, or whatever that period of time is, you can do a piece of work, look at that, and work out, actually, should we be planning to swap this piece of equipment out? Meantime, to recovery of service, so that measures how quickly a service is restored after a failure. So, for example, a service with a MTRS of 4 hours will, on average, fully recover from failure in 4 hours. It doesn't mean it will always be restored in that amount of time. It's an average, and you would usually use incidents to analyse that and other records. Older services were designed with quite high failure average rates, so they wouldn't always fail quite so often. But there's a definite sort of shift towards optimizing design and architecture, so you're minimizing that number and ultimately recovering quickly, and that service will recover. So yeah, just I guess kind of thinking about metrics for a moment and some real world experience here. Keep in mind the other elements of access to that service. So using that guiding principle of thinking holistically. Don't just look at the application. Think about, well, hang on, there's lots of other components in this ecosystem. There's a database, there's a server in there, there's virtual machines, there's a networking connectivity. So when you agree your metrics, make sure you've got your end-to-end service reporting hat on, because that will inevitably cause a bit of friction if you're in the situation where you're saying, well, the service is available, as in the application is up and operating, or the database is up and operating. But clearly, if the network's down, there's quite a fundamental problem there in terms of it's available, it's just not accessible. So make sure your contracts with service providers, service integrators, whoever, or whether it's your internal departments, make sure you've thought that through as to, are you doing end-to-end service reporting? And a slight tangent off on that, only a tiny bit, is the performance point. Again, I've seen in organisations where the system is technically up, it's available, it's there, it's not down, but it's very, very slow, like really, really slow. Like customers are just getting so frustrated. They're just thinking, oh, well, I can't use it. I'm pressing search and I have to go and make a coffee, and it might come back 10 minutes later with some information. Is that available? Or is it not available? It's just a question, really. Clearly, in my eyes, that is not available, and the way that you can address that are things like performance and response metrics to make sure you have a definition of availability. So let's talk about the ITIL4 service value chain as well. So when it comes to availability management, like all the other practices in general management, in service management and technical management, the service value chain, which is covering planning, improving, engaging, designing and transition, obtaining, build, deliver and support, the availability management practice touches all of those. However, there is a main emphasis around the plan activity there, so portfolio decisions, goal setting for practices, for products and your services. So again, just flipping back into some real world experience around availability management and the activities that I would encourage you to think about if you're looking to get the best out of availability management. So architecture, I've mentioned that a few times. This is a key element to availability management. It's so important. If you're starting in a green field and it's a brand new service, lucky you. You've got the opportunity to really look at the resilience, the scaling, the design, continual improvement. You know, lots of areas to build a resilient and available service. So the architecture point, don't underestimate the importance of architecture. It's right at the beginning of the exercise, of course, but really think about how is this going to work? How will it be available over multiple, perhaps countries or regional zones or data centers? You know, however you think about it, just make sure architecture is core around your availability thinking. It will dictate. So if you know if a system needs to be 99.999% available, your architecture can be dictated by that, as opposed to somebody who's saying, actually, as long as it's 95% available, that's fine for us. That's two different architecture approaches, and there may well be two different costs there as well. If you have an existing environment where you might look at the architecture and you would want to look at continual improvement, architectural activities that can improve availability. So again, you would point back to the general management practice there, where you've got architecture management, but you've also got that continual improvement element there as well, as to, okay, we are where we are, how can we make that better? What can we do? How do we keep that momentum going? So architecture would be my number one. You really need to think about this and just make sure that's at the core, both from a new service and from an existing service. The second point would be end-to-end. So what I mean by that is think end-to-end when it comes to availability. Don't look at a server, don't look at an application, don't look at a particular component. It's important you take that holistic approach. The guiding principles within ITIL4 talks about taking an holistic approach. Look at it end to end. Look at it from start to finish. A service isn't just an application. It's the server, it's the associated infrastructure, it's the networking connectivity, it's database, it's lots of different compute elements. So really think through that availability when it comes to reporting back to your customer or back to your internal stakeholders within your organisation. I mentioned earlier about a system may well be up, or a product or a service may well be up, maybe the server's up, the application's up, but if the network's down, From a customer perspective, the system is not available. Now you can argue semantics there and you can say, well, the application is up, the server's up. That doesn't really wash. From a customer service perspective, they cannot use the system. Sure, it's the network that's down, but from a customer perspective, the service is not available. So that does need some thought there. And have you defined that? Have you had those conversations? Perhaps a response rate tolerance could be something that might need to be explored. The other area I can think of that has kind of caught organisations out in terms of their availability reporting is not including maintenance windows or not agreeing service hours as to when the stats are presented, maybe at a monthly service review. There needs to be a maintenance window for a service provider to perform essential maintenance. Now, depending on your architecture, of course, you may have complete full resilience and it doesn't really matter because you could do the maintenance during the middle of the day because from a customer perspective they wouldn't know because you've thought through your architecture and you're operating from from a different location or whatever it may be. If you've got a more perhaps a less designed system where maintenance means outage, you need to factor that in. When are those maintenance windows? I've worked in an organisation where it's been quite straightforward in terms of the first Sunday of every month has been classified as a maintenance window, and that's been reflected back to the stakeholders and the customers, and everyone is absolutely aware. First Sunday of the month, that's the maintenance window, and all the service packs, updates, maintenance activities, database work, so on and so forth, happens on that day. That's excluded from the reporting. And service hours is the other point. So when you talk about operational period, when you're working the maths out behind the scenes as to what is the availability, are you working that out 24/7 or are you working out that 9 to 5 Monday to Friday? Your stats will look very different depending on how you report on those. Make sure it's clear for the avoidance of doubt and all the rest of it. Just make sure that's clear, that all parties are aware. Automated recovery procedures is another element we're encouraged to think about and get the best out of availability. So anything that's linked to monitoring, so if there's an alert of some kind that says a system is down, perhaps there can be an automated response that corrects that activity, and it could be something as simple as it restarts the service. So if a Windows service, for the sake of argument, stalls, an alert is generated, it goes off into the service management tool, and perhaps there's an automated script that goes, when this happens, what we need to do is automatically restart service ABC within Windows, and off it goes and restarts that service, and the service is back again. But look for automated recovery procedures and corrective action. At its most practical sense, if there is an alert, you want to be making sure that your service management tool has a ticket created, and then that is in the right assignment group for whatever that system or service is. And then the final point that I would encourage everyone to do is practice recovery. So look at local failures, look at a full system DR exercise, look at failover exercises, resilience testing. All of these things can have a big impact in terms of your availability. So make sure that they are tested. Perhaps that might be during a maintenance window, talking about the point a few moments ago. But either way, make sure there are regular activities around failover, disaster recovery, resilience testing, so you can maintain that availability. Certainly, in some of the organisations I've consulted at over the last 5 years or so, I've been involved in a number of regulatory organisations that require, and they need to see the evidence that you have indeed performed these activities, and they want to see the reports that you have done that. What was found, what was tested, how did it work? So then I suppose really just a very quick summary and sort of final thought on availability management. A lot of cloud service providers, CSPs, have something as a central tenet within their way of delivering their cloud services, their architecture. And AWS, for example, has a reliability pillar, which is part of their well-architected framework. And the AWS well-architected framework helps architects build not only secure, high-performing, resilient and effective infrastructure and applications, but it builds on that pillar of operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, efficiency, and ultimately optimization. So really think through if you are dealing with availability overall, make sure you're taking an holistic approach to this, because I think too often people kind of get quite focused in on a specific application. It's really important. In fact, it's an absolute principle, a guiding principle within the ITIL4 world to look at things holistically. The architecture, 100%, you really must focus on that in order to ensure you have a well thought through availability plan. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Please do subscribe and hit the bell to continue to get the updates. Thank you very much.